Hey guys, it's Simon and welcome back to the LibGDX RPG Kotlin tutorial series. In the last part, we added now some text information to our game. We also deactivated the debug system. So now what we can do is when we damage a slime, for example, we see now this damage numbers floating away, which is great because before they simply just disappeared and we had no idea that we were attacking them. Now we have at least that. And this part is an easier one again before we go into one of the more complex topics again from the tutorial series, which would be the AI part. But in this part, I wanted to keep it simple. Let's say one regeneration part for you to digest all the information that you learned before. And what we are going to do is now to introduce a so-called loot component. And what do we use that for? Because currently when we start up our game, we have already a chest entity available with a graphic, and also we can play certain animations for it, but we cannot interact with it. So it will always remain closed and does not do anything. And that one we are going to change in this part. And the way I solved that is that I simply introduced a so-called loot component, and any entity that you can loot will get a loot component. So first thing we need to do is to create a new component to introduce our new logic. So there, as mentioned, I used a loot component, and here we have a interact entity. So what kind of entity is interacting with a lootable entity? And that one is an entity which is by default null, because at the beginning nothing is interacting with a lootable component, with a lootable entity. And once an entity wants to interact with it or loot it, then this interact entity will be set to a specific entity that wants to loot, and then the loot system kicks in and does something. Okay, so loot component. Next thing is then the loot system, which iterates over all entities that have a loot component. And it's again an iterating system. Good, so in this system we need access, of course, to our loot components. We also need access to the animation components, because if the entity that gets looted, in our case our chest, if it has an animation component, then we are going to set a specific animation. So for example, in the case of the chest, that it opens up. Good, so the important part here is with our loot component from our entity, we check, is the interact entity null? And if yes, then do nothing, because no one wants to loot with it, so we don't care. Here we know someone wants to loot with it or wants to loot it. So first of all, we're going to configure our entity and we remove its loot component, so that you cannot loot it again and again, that this is only done once. And also in case it has an animation component. So if it has an animation component, then we are going to do certain things. So the first thing that we're going to do is we set the next animation. And there we simply want to change the animation type, which is in that case the open animation. We don't have this method yet, I think. Let me check. Yeah, currently we only have it with the model, but the model we store. Yeah, so let's create here another function without the model. So we want to keep that. And that's already it. So now going back to our loot system. So now we can call it like that. And the mode, so our animation mode, is that we only want to play that animation once. So for that one, we will pick the play mode normal, that we don't loop through that. Good, then we need to add this system, of course. So we switch to our game screen, and there after the attack system, because there we are going to add this logic that we can then also, that we set this interact entity of the loot component. So there we will add the loot system. Then we go to our entity spawn system, because here now for our chest, so for that specific type here, we want to add now a loot component to it. So what we could do, we could configure our spawn configuration, which is the cleanest solution, I would say. So let's quickly do that. So there we have another configuration. Let's call it lootable, which is a boolean, and per default this is false. Just for your information, I did not do it like that in the GitHub project. There I simply hard-coded it to the chest, but I think this is the preferable solution, so that you can configure that. So what kind of thing is lootable, and there in our chest we can now set that. So lootable is equal to true. And now when we spawn such an entity, we can simply check for that. Let's do that here. So if our configuration is lootable, then we add the lootable component or loot component to such an entity. Great stuff. So the last thing is now in our attack system. So this is how I solved it for that specific game. So here where we have the box2d query, and we iterate over all the different entities that we can potentially attack. So here we are now checking if the entity that we are going to attack, or that gets damaged, let's say, has a loot component, and if yes, then we set this interact entity. So here we check, so does this entity have a live component, then we would deal damage to it. Chest does not have a live component, so we don't need that. And the next thing would be that for our loot components, we need to add that here. So here we would have something similar. So if an entity has that, then we configure it, and here we would then say something like, what did we call it? Interact entity equals to the entity that deals damage here. And here we need to take care of something as well, because we only want that our player can actually loot something, and not that, for example, when a slime is attacking and he by accident then maybe attacks the chest, that maybe the slime would loot the chest. So we don't want that. So here we will add an additional check, and we'll check if the entity is in our player component, so that the entity is really a player. So let's add those two components here as well to our system. And I think, let's see. Yeah, so you see here already, that would be an example for me where we should think about to split that maybe up, because it's getting already quite a lot of information into that single system, which is not that great, I would say. So I would, here at that point, we have now, how many do we have? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have already 6 different components in that system. So here I would think if maybe that could be split up. For now, we don't do that. We keep it simple in the tutorial series, but just that you think about such things. So when you have here a lot of different components that your system needs, then maybe think about splitting something up, which we could definitely do here. But again, to keep it simple, we keep it like that. Okay, so let's check again. So if our entity which is attacking is a player, then, and the entity that we are attacking has a loot component, then we set this interact entity, and that should already be it if we have all the animations and everything available, because with that we will end up in our loot system. There we have now an interact entity because of our attack system. We then remove the loot component so that we don't enter this code here again and again. And we set the open animation for such entities and play it only once. Okay, let's see. So in theory, this should already work. Did I add the loot system? Yes, I did. Then let's go to a chest, and I'm afraid of pressing the attack button. Wow, it's working. I'm really impressed. It's I think since a couple of parts, it's the first time that something is happening on the first try. Okay, great. I can also spam the attack animation. You see there is no damage number popping up because this chest does not have a live component, so our floating text system also does not kick in. It does, of course, with the slimes, but not with the chest. And the chest is playing its open animation just once and then remains open. Cool. So yeah, that's actually already it. So this is a shorter part. As mentioned, a little bit of an easier one. You could extend that here, of course. So this is just a showcase how you can solve such a problem. What we are missing here now, for example, that something is inside this chest. So that the player maybe gets a pop-up information in the user interface, what kind of things he got, or maybe like in Zelda, play a little bit of an animation, how he's carrying the item that he got out of this chest, and maybe play a little jingle and things like that. That one we will add, by the way, later on. So we will also add here a sound effect when the chest gets opened, that we have that available. But we will not implement like an inventory system or a user interface for the pop-up. That one you can look up in my other tutorials if you are interested, or just try it out yourself and implement something. Okay, yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching, and see you then in the next part when we are finally then introducing the different states for our player, that he's then correctly playing an attack animation, run animation, and things like that. So then we are really closing in on our game and giving it the final touch that it feels and looks a little bit better. So thank you again, and see you in the next one. Bye bye.